Minutes.
Um,
OPDs at PG are still through telemedicine or
Yes, sir.
the
Not,
regular?
there one is through the telemedicine. Telemedicine consults are going on, and the other one is through the. It's a basically what they've done is it's basically of just different from telemedicine is that they provided WhatsApp enabled phones. So
Okay.
people have to register from 8 o'clock till 9:30 in the morning for any of the OPDs, and
Okay.
then they can talk to the doctor directly and they can send their reports on the WhatsApp. So it's just short of physical examination. At least they can get face to face with the telemedicine. में तो वो that's a different.
Yeah, telemedicine is relatively more
Yes.
cumbersome in that sense.
Cumbersome, हाँ जी.
System. So, but this WhatsApp has made life relatively easier as far as.
Yes, it is easier for the patient, sir, but it is kind of
it's-
challenging for the doctor.
I agree with that.
उसमें because मरीज कई बारी WhatsApp में उनको दो तीन it's basically you are trying to request them to send the reports, so to talk to them, sometimes call them 2 times 4 times, और फिर वो screen के ऊपर reports sometimes they are not of good quality,
बिल्कुल
pictures are not good, so it's
और वो इतना कई बार तो धब्बा भेज देते हैं
पूरा भेज देते हैं sir. So it is very difficult.
You don't know what to select and what not.
Sir, you will not believe me. With 100 registrations, the other day, our OPD went on till 4 o'clock, only with 106 registrations. So एक बहुत ज़्यादा समय, हालांकि शुरू भी 10 बजे के बाद करते हैं, not at 9 o'clock, but it went on till 4 o'clock.
I can understand. In fact, it takes more time than the
Much more time, sir. Because though people have this facility, but not all are tech savvy. In the sense, the patients who call up, they may not. They take their own time to send the record and everything.
Sure.
I think we can start now. It's 7:00. We have almost 30 participants.
ठीक है, I think should we start then?
Yes, sir.
Is everything ready? Okay. Okay, good evening, participants. I'm most pleased to welcome you all to this webinar on pulmonary fibrosis, the recent developments. We only discuss some aspects, and for that purpose, we have very eminent faculty with us today. Professor Aman Sharma, Dr. Sajal Dhuria, Dr. Amit Mandal, and Aditya Jindal. I'm very pleased to welcome all the faculty for this meeting. Professor Aman Sharma, of course, is the professor of clinical immunology and rheumatology services in the Department of Internal Medicine, and his special interest is CTD-induced interstitial lung diseases and pulmonary fibrosis. Dr. Sajal Dhuria, one of my colleague again, he is an assistant professor in the Department of Pulmonary Medicine, again at the PGI Chandigarh, and of course his special interest is interstitial lung disease, in particular pulmonary fibrosis, and I think he has numerous publications and one of the pioneers in the field in this country. So, Dr. Amit Mandal is a senior consultant whom you all know. I think he is at the Fortis Hospital. Again, he deals with all kinds of pulmonary diseases, in particular pulmonary fibrosis and critical care and so on. Aditya Jindal again is a pulmonologist, pulmonary consultant. So I think we'll have a very kind of knowledgeable faculty on this subject. Interstitial lung, although our subject is pulmonary fibrosis in particular, and looking after CTD-induced fibrosing illness and the hypersensitivity pneumonias, and then Dr. Sahgal is going to talk on the management of these disorders with antifibrotic drugs in particular. And thereafter we'll have a panel discussion to answer to some of the specific issues which arise after their talks. I'll request all the speakers to be brief because we have relatively less time for each talk, only about 20 minutes. So I'm sure we'll be able to finish in time. So without going into further details, I'll request Dr. Aman Sharma to talk about the CTD, the approach to CTD-induced CTD-ILDs. Dr. Aman, please.
Thank you, sir. It's indeed a great privilege to be on the same panel as Professor Jindal and with my colleagues, Dr. Sahgal and Aditya and Dr. Mandal. My brief is to talk about approach to diagnosis of CTD, and my perspective would be that of a rheumatologist, and to give you a bird's eye view of how do we really approach the CTD associated ILD, and give you a bird's eye view of how these individual conditions can be managed. So just give me, I think there is.
So you can use the arrow keys also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So here we go. Basically, the CTD ILD makes a substantial chunk of interstitial lung disease. It is pertinent for all of us to pick up the soft pointers which might be there in patients who present with interstitial lung disease. And the connective tissue diseases, they are characterized by circulating autoantibodies, and also when there are systemic manifestations which are considered to be related to the autoimmune diseases, so which may cause the damage. So the specific CTDs which are associated with interstitial lung disease, it's a very exhaustive list. But towards your right-hand side panel, the ones like ANCA-associated vasculitis, spondyloarthropathies, relapsing polychondritis, Behçet's, and even APLA, they are very rarely associated, although you might get these are just like once in a lifetime. And just for the sake of inclusion, I have for completion, I've included these here. But the ones which are more commonly associated are conditions like scleroderma, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory muscle diseases, lupus, Sjogren syndrome, mixed connective tissue disease, and IPAF, which I'll talk to in some detail. So when we talk about interstitial lung disease in this setting of a connective tissue disease, so 3 clinical scenarios are possible. The first one is there is an established connective tissue disease which we know, and there is an ILD. So life is easy there. The second is CTD, which presents for the first time as interstitial lung disease, which sometimes this might belong to a group what we call as lung dominant CTD. And then there are others. The third scenario is when there is interstitial lung disease and there are some features of autoimmunity, but not enough to give a unifying label of a given disease. So, this is the least of the least complex of the scenarios. It might be clinically relevant, but many times it might just be radiological finding, may not have any clinical connotations. Whenever up against such scenario, we have to think about drugs like methotrexate and various biological response modifiers. One has to be sensitive to the drug. A drug history is very important. What kind of drugs, especially for rheumatoid arthritis, there is a wide array of drugs which are available. And also we have to be thinking about infections when it so happens. Just to give you some brief, I'm not going to go through the details, but These and many more drugs are there, and there are different types of associations which have been reported with different anti-rheumatic drugs. If you look at the prevalence and characteristics of CTD in different diseases, systemic sclerosis tops the list, which up to 70 to 90% HRCT changes, and almost half of them will have moderate to severe interstitial lung disease over a period of time. And NSIP pattern is usually more common than UIP. It occurs mostly in the first 5 years of the disease onset. Nuclear ANA or SCL70 antibody positivity is associated, more so associated with severe interstitial lung disease. The other group which is more commonly associated with is inflammatory muscle diseases like polymyositis, dermatomyositis. NICP pattern is more common than UIP. Dermatomyositis is more commonly associated than polymyositis. Dermatomyositis is the one muscle disease which is associated with the skin rash. I think all of us are aware, but one needs to know a little bit more about an entity which is associated with anti-MDA5, which might have a skin rash but may not have muscle weakness. So which is what we call as amyopathic form, and it is associated with one of the most severe forms of interstitial lung diseases, which is called a rapidly progressive ILD, and which requires probably the most aggressive immunosuppression, or the combination of immunotherapy is required, and still hoping for the best because mortality is very high in such scenarios. The other is rheumatoid arthritis, the varying reports of prevalence. UIP we know is more commonly associated than NSIP, and then organizing pneumonia. Most of these patients are having seropositive disease. There is some association with smoking and is seen more commonly in males. Mixed connective tissue disease, there is a classical criteria. It is characterized by U1 RNP positivity. And again, like some of the other connective tissue diseases, NICP pattern is more common than UIP. And generally, the systemic sclerosis like clinical findings and autoantibody findings are there in this. Sjogren's, we all know, it is associated with NSIP pattern, has Sika symptoms, but the unique association is with LIP. And also, we have seen a couple of patients with lymphoma. One patient who my guru, Dr. Bhamri, used to treat, had a lymphoma within the lung, presented as a lung mass, but it was a lymphoma in a patient with Sjogren's syndrome. The patient used to come from Ahmedabad. So always consider lymphoma in the differential diagnosis. UCTD, well, very limited data. Again, any of these patterns can be there. NSIP more commonly than UIP. There are some features of RA, there are some features of systemic sclerosis. I think I'll just briefly talk about, I've already talked about UIP being more common, more dominant pattern, rheumatoid arthritis, organizing pneumonia, more commonly associated with inflammatory muscle diseases, and LIP is more common in Sjogren's syndrome. But does it really matter to know if the ILD is associated with CTD or not? Yes, it does matter, because the clinical outcomes, the therapeutic outcomes, or these, they are very different from CTD ILD as compared to idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So it is very important for anybody treating these patients with this lung disease to pick up the cues, because then there may be there is a very much, the outcomes are very much different. The other scenario is when CTD is present as interstitial lung diseases, 10 to 30% of muscle disease may first time present as ILD. So look, and the muscle disease is sometimes just a mild ache, mild fatigue, may not, over a period of time, it might develop into a full-blown muscle disease. So therein, it is important to pick up the cues. I'll quickly show you the photographs very soon. Occasionally, it might occur with RA, not very commonly, and rarely also with systemic sclerosis. So the challenge is when the CTD manifestations are subtle. The third scenario is some features, some autoimmune features, some clinical features, pathology and or radiology suggestive of connective tissue disease, CTD, and but they are not enough for us to give one unifying label. European Respiratory Society and ATS research statement talked about IPAF in 2015, and for us to make a diagnosis, there has to be a presence of interstitial pneumonia either on HRCT or surgical lung biopsy, plus we have to exclude all other causes, And there is no definite, we have different criteria to make a diagnosis of systemic sclerosis, diagnosis of different inflammatory muscle diseases. I think it is beyond the purview of this talk to talk about all those criteria. But we have to know that this doesn't really fit into any of those criteria. And there has to be at least one feature in 2 of the 3 domains, which are clinical domain, serological domain, and morphological domain. Clinical domain, you don't have to mug up all these. I'll show you the pictures. Briefly, mechanics, hands, fingertip ulcerations, polyarthritis, palmar telangiectasia, which are also associated with systemic sclerosis, Raynaud's phenomena, digital edema, and unexplained rash on which is Gottron sign. Various autoantibody positivities, like we do the screen with ANA, rheumatoid factor, anti-CCP, dsDNAs, Rho and La, and anti-ribonucleoprotein, anti-Smith, topoisomerase or SCL70, which I was told you with has a poor prognosis, and tRNA synthetase, PMSCL, and anti-MDF5. So morphologically, radiological picture or histopathological picture of the entities that we've talked about, or a multi-compartment involvement in addition to interstitial pneumonia, which is, I think this is what I want to draw your attention to, is unexplained pleural effusion or thickening, unexplained pericardial effusion or thickening, and unexplained even intrinsic airway disease either on PFT or imaging or pathology, or unexplained pulmonary vasculopathy. So what are the, Raynaud's, we are all aware, but patients may not give the classical history of first pallor and then bluish discoloration. Some of the patients might just give history of pallor. The other patients might give the history of only blue discoloration. And only few patients will give you classical history of first pallor and then followed by bluish discoloration, as we are seeing here. The other thing is, sometimes the skin thickening is only confined to the fingers. As you can see here, the best thing is try to pinch in between the IP joints. And if as you can see here, the skin is not being pinched as compared to here. The other thing that you should always look for is whether there is a pulp loss or there is a decrease in the height of this digit. These are other things which you should carefully look for. These are suggestive of systemic sclerosis more commonly. You can see there are these fingertip ulceration, there is sometimes pulp loss, and if this is very extensive, then you can have gangrene of the digits. The other sign which is associated with dermatomyositis, this is Gottron sign, or you can have papules here, or even here, when we call as Gottron's papules. I talked about MDA5. So if you have papules over the palmar aspect, like this here, or if you could see here, or if you could see here, this was the patient that we saw in the outpatient, and we immediately thought about, and there was thought about MDA5. This is MDA5. These are what we call as inverse Gottrons. And this has got a clinical association with MDA5 associated disease, the same we subsequently published in Rheumatology Oxford. So all keep an eye on these clinical signs. The other is mechanics hands. You have fissuring over the lateral aspect of the fingers, which over a period of time increases to involve the fingertips and the whole of the hands occasionally. This was a young boy who had dermatomyositis, and you can see very bad mechanics hands. This was juvenile dermatomyositis, and you can see the hands clearing up beautifully with therapy. The other thing which is associated with dermatomyositis, you can see this purple pink hue around the eyebrows here, around the eyebrows, you can see these here also. This is a classical heliotrope sign in our patient of dermatomyositis who had CA bladder. So these are the signs which one should always look for. This was again our patient which we got as a patient of dengue with thrombocytopenia and fever and rash. But this was a dermatomyositis with a heliotrope rash because of paraneoplastic manifestation. She had wheezing, she had respiratory failure, and she had ileal carcinoid associated with dermatomyositis, came with fever and wheeze. The other rashes, these are very profound rash which spares the nasolabial fold. This is in SLE. This is again the malar rash, which classically spares the nasolabial fold. But if I could draw your attention to the fingers here in the you know, in the over the knuckles there is no rash, but in between the proximal and the distal interphalangeal joint, if you see the rash here and the fingers here, this is what you call as lupus hands. More aggressive rash, discoid lesion here, discoid lesion over the ear lobule. So to differentiate, this is a lupus hand, as I have told you, in between the proximal and whereas if you could see the subtle papules here, these are the Gottron papules, and there is some Gottron sign here. The other thing that one should look for is alopecia. Basically, one has to look for other things look for joint swelling, pain, morning stiffness, muscle weakness, and sicca symptoms. So the most important thing is when you up against the wall, try to build partnerships. And you know, this is the landmark Calcutta test partnership. I think the pulmonologist should make a partnership with the rheumatologist. Why I say so is then pre-ILD clinical diagnosis of IPS becomes antisynthetase syndrome, and you can see IPF becomes a UCTD. And you are well aware ILD not otherwise specific turns out to be vaginous granulomatosis. So the diagnosis changes when you include because it is beyond the purview of any single talk to give all these nuances which are associated with picking up. We rheumatologists have to pick up the clinical cues to making these diagnoses. And suspecting CTD and HRCT, I think sir has told to quickly wrap up. So I'll just say that just quickly go through most of these. Systemic sclerosis with subtle reticular changes, PAH and dilated esophagus in systemic sclerosis, esophageal dysmotility, minimal reticular changes, JO1 with antisynthetase. I think the pulmonologists would be are much know far greater, have knowledge than what we possess while interpreting these. Just these are the cystic changes associated with LIP. Up to, as I said, up to 90% of patients with anti-JO1 disease develop interstitial lung disease, and anti-PL5 and PL12 have high incidence. And hyperferritinemia, this is associated with MDF5 associated rapidly progressive interstitial lung disease. Systemic sclerosis, there is esophageal dysmotility and GERD with increased age, male sex. And I think basically one has to look for the extent of the disease, whether there is presence of honeycombing, and there has to be these are the risk factors: diffuse disease versus anti-SCL70. I've talked about most of these things. How do we approach? There has to be a staging. We look at how much extent of the disease, less than 20%, while we're making treatment decisions. How much is the FVC? If it is less than 20% of the total area, or FVC is more than 70%, it's a limited disease. Beyond it is an extensive disease. Clinical approach is correlation between NSE pattern and biopsy is less robust. Surgical biopsy is not really preferred in CTD-ILD, but in occasional cases where CTD-ILD, if you're not making a headway, then once in your lifetime, maybe you can do. We had a patient of suspected sarcoid with the lung involvement, when going to various different institutions, coming from Nepal, eventually ending up with us. And once we did the Dr. Bambri ordered an open lung biopsy, it turned out to be a lipoid pneumonia. So it may, but that is the only that I can remember in 20 years that I've been here. So it's rare, and probably we have experts who can vouch for it more than what I can do. So again, a long list of autoantibodies. I just enumerated most of those. Just to say that probably you'll have to pitch in the rheumatologist here to really decipher and tease out the clinical relevance of positivity in a given clinical context. Again, it is not exhaustive list. There are various others, but I just wish to sensitize. I just don't wish to go into the finer details. I can just tell you that positivity of each can sometimes give us cues to the differential diagnosis as is listed here. You all are aware about antisynthetase syndrome. Sometimes we can do the prognostication, look for cancer-associated dermatomyositis like TIF1 gamma, and we can look for other screens for association of mitotic diseases. So basically, that's where we are. And I think my domain is not to talk about treatment. So basically, the inner core is looking at dyspnea, cough, lung imaging, functional status and survival, lung physiology, and health-related quality of life. The outer core, as far as the outcome measure that we are looking at these days, is event-free survival. And the research agenda is, can we have a biomarker which can be determined, and development of CTD-ILD related patient-reported outcomes. So These probably would have changed over the last few years, but we still need to go a long way before we can really wind up all this. With this, I would like to conclude that some connective tissue diseases are associated with interstitial lung disease. Clinical clues and lab investigations can help us in establishing the diagnosis. Combined team approach can result in better outcomes. I would really thank all the viewers, and also thank Jindal sir for this very wonderful opportunity that he's given me to share the share my views on CTD associated interstitial lung disease.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. I think that was a very lucid and concise talk. We'll have questions at the end of all the 3 talks. But I must say that the point made by Dr. Sharma, that the rheumatologists must be taken on board while deciding the approach to interstitial lung disease and its management. I think that need has risen manifold in the recent past. Well, we'll come to these issues at the end of our session. Meanwhile, I'll request Aditya to talk on hypersensitivity pneumonia. It's a kind of a different issue, but nonetheless ending with the same outcomes, you see, pulmonary fibrosis.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so after a nice talk on connective tissue disease associated ILDs, I'll be moving on to purely lung conditions like hypersensitivity pneumonia. And I'll be focusing mainly on chronic hypersensitivity pneumonia as compared to the acute and subacute forms. So the common forms seen in clinical practice are acute and subacute hypersensitivity pneumonitis. So less is known about chronic hypersensitivity pneumonia. So hypersensitive pneumonitis is also known as extrinsic allergic alveolitis because it is due to extrinsic, it is due to the sensitization to an external antigen which is introduced into the lungs, and thus it results from repeated inhalation of and sensitization to a wide variety of aerosolized antigens. And this may or may not be accompanied by systemic manifestations, and the prototype or the archetypal hypersensitive pneumonitis is farmer's lung, which has been due to exposure to moldy hay, and this generally causes an acute hypersensitivity pneumonitis. There are other forms, there are more than I think 100 forms of or antigens described which can cause hypersensitivity pneumonitis. The prototype for chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis is bird fancier's lung, and people who raise birds for a living, those people develop these kind of lung manifestations. These are some of the common major classes of antigens which actually cause hypersensitivity pneumonitis. And you can see that they include bacteria, fungi, mycobacteria, and this is a very common, this occurs occasionally. I don't know whether it's been reported from India, but there have been some reports from the US about mycobacteria being present in swimming pools and hot tubs. Animal proteins, like we had a recent, and chemicals. So we had a recent patient of bagasosis, and this patient was exposed to sugarcane. He was working in a factory, and incidentally he came out to be corona positive and led us all to become quarantined, but that's beside the point. So what I mean to say that these patients are not very uncommon. Now, chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis is a specific type of hypersensitivity pneumonitis, and the incidence and prevalence are difficult to estimate. And generally, the accepted prevalence is around 4 to 15% of all ILDs, all interstitial lung diseases. And the range varies from place to place, and from season to season. 1 to 19% of farmers exposed to moldy hay developed farmer's lung in one study. And this is more common in the winters in some place and in males as compared to females. While it's been noted that 6 to 20% of individuals exposed to bird droppings develop bird fancier's lung. The pathogenetic mechanism of chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis is different from that in acute and subacute pneumonitis. So the acute type features, both of these are lymphocytic due to lymphocytic infiltration in the lung, due to the deposition of immune complexes in the lungs, while the chronic type is more due to the T cell mediated and has features of both type 3 and type 4 hypersensitivity. In the subacute form, you can see that there is a T helper 1 type of inflammatory response as compared, while in the chronic one, there is more of a T helper 2 type of hyperinflammatory response. Now, this is reports from the ILD registry in India, and so a large study in which they found the incidence and prevalence of various ILDs, and can see that the incidence of the diagnosis of ILD was made by a multidisciplinary discussion at 2 or 3 centers, and they found that the incidence of hypersensitivity pneumonitis was the highest in their case series. And you can see that almost 47.3%. This might not be representative of all the areas, but I would still say that chronic hypersensitive pneumonitis is much more common than what is generally assumed, and we see day and day out in our OPDs. Just something about the immune response in hypersensitivity pneumonitis, because the theory for the hypersensitive pneumonitis is that it's a 2-hit. The hypothesis is that there are 2 hits. So there is a genetic or a predisposition, and there might be additional environmental factors which promote this. And if there is a persistent sort of antigenic exposure, that might lead to the development of fibrosis. So the A is the sensitization and immune memory formation. At this point, if the antigen is sort of goes away, or there is no further exposure to the antigen, or sometimes or a lot of times immune tolerance develops, so there is a normal response. In some people who are predisposed to this thing, there might be acute or subacute inflammation, and if the exposure is avoided, then there is a reversion to normality, and again goes back to normal. But in some patients where there is a low dose chronic antigen exposure and predisposition, this leads to granulomatous inflammation and development of fibrosis. And this is just to show the same thing. This is the normal alveoli, and there is a lot of macrophagic inflammation, and over a period of time, there is a formation of granulomas, fibrosis, and in the end, this leads to alveolitis, the chronic alveolitis or the interstitial lung disease. The pathology is mainly limited to the terminal bronchioles, the alveoli, and the interstitium. So this can, at the end, the features may almost be indistinguishable from other kinds of lung fibrosis. So what are the symptoms of chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis? They are similar to other types of chronic ILDs, and it has the onset is insidious over a period of months to years. There is a slowly progressive cough, exertional dyspnea, fatigue, and weight loss. Exertional or systemic symptoms may be slightly more than in autoimmune ILDs, like in sort of idiopathic ILDs like IPF or NSIP. And it is important to note that there may be a lack of history of any acute episodes in the past. So that is one major thing. And after the fibrosis has been established, the removal of the offending agent may result only in partial improvement in these cases. In advanced diseases like any other ILD, there might be digital clubbing, respiratory failure, end-stage fibrosis, and pulmonary hypertension. Just a difference between acute HP and chronic HP. Classically, the hypersensitive pneumonitis has been divided into 3 parts or 3 sort of syndromes: the acute HP, subacute HP, and chronic HP. Now they have been sort of lot of things are coming out that there are only 2 forms based on the treatment and pathology, that is the acute and chronic. The acute HP is mostly reversible and complete resolution is possible, and the symptoms are related to the exposure to the inducing agent, and which can be resolved completely after avoidance, while this is not so in chronic HP. There might be some potential for reversibility, but most of the time there is a risk of progression. We'll talk about the HRCT and the histopathology changes later on. Now, the diagnosis of hypersensitive pneumonitis, there is no single test or any, which can actually tell us whether this is HP or not. So it relies on a combination of clinical suspicion, precipitant testing, radiological and histopathological evidence. any patient who comes on, we just be focusing on the main tests. These are not to say that these are the only tests which should be done, but common the pulmonary function test, the spirometry and DLC. So the difference, if a patient of acute hypersensitivity pneumonitis comes to us, they'll generally be showing a obstructive airway pattern. DLCO may be normal or may not be normal, but as the chronicity increases, the fibrosis increases, the spirometry will change from an obstructive to a restrictive or a mixed pattern, and the DLC will start decreasing as in any chronic ILD, and that can be used to measure the prognosis and the progress of the disease. Serum precipitin tests are available for some sort of antigens and antibodies. For example, for the limited panel is available in the market. Outside of research labs, I think only for pigeons and for Aspergillus infections and for a few others. I think 4 or 5 antigens are available. And if there is I think more focus should be made on the clinical history and to try and find out if any clear-cut sort of exposure is there. Serum precipitins can be done to confirm the diagnosis, but I would not say that these are pathognomonic. If they are high, it might be a false positivity also, because a lot of these patients do have the precipitins or the antibodies, but may not have the syndrome as such. Now, one of the most important things to investigations to do in HP is the radiology, and the difference in the acute versus chronic is marked. So the acute hypersensitivity pneumonitis is generally manifests with central lobular nodules, or if it's in a very acute stage, you can get ground glass opacities. But over a period of time, as the subacute stage forms, there is presence of central lobular nodules. But as chronicity grows, there is formation of fibrosis, and this fibrosis is generally sort of limited to the upper lobes of the lungs. However, this is not true in all cases. A lot of times you can find fibrosis in the lower parts of the lungs. So, but if a patient comes to you with ILD and has upper lobe fibrosis, hypersensitivity, chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis should be among one of the main differential diagnoses. You can see some areas of traction bronchiectasis and some areas of septal thickening, and the expiratory scans will show areas of air trapping and mosaic attenuation. You can see them here. And the arrows are showing areas of traction bronchiectasis, some honeycombing in the later stages. And as the chronicity grows, the chronic fibrotic features will come out more commonly. There is the presence of the mosaic attenuation in expiratory scans. And so the main differential diagnosis at this stage would be NSIPA or IPF and sarcoidosis. So sarcoidosis generally has a lot of mediastinal lymphadenopathy probably, and there is a typical, the fibrotic is perihilar and it's progressing to the lungs. While to differentiate from NSIP and IPF, the main features, the secondary sort of after the traction bronchiectasis, septal thickenings, the 3 main things which can differentiate HP from NSIP or IPF, UIP are the lobular areas of mosaic attenuation. You can see that they are more common in chronic HP than in IPF or NSIP. Central lobular nodules are more common in HP and is very uncommon in IPF and NSIP. Thin-walled cysts again are more common in HP, very rare in IPF and sometimes in NSIP. Interestingly, the presence of honeycombing does not differentiate between chronic HP and IPF. Maybe the distribution of the honeycombing might be a pattern, but it is quite common in chronic HP. And this is just to show the head cheese appearance, which is a commonly used term, which is sort of one of the signs which is highly suggestive of HP, in which there is in the same lung, you can see areas of consolidation and areas of mosaic trapping and ground glassing. And the additional features here are just that this has ruptured and there is lead to subcutaneous emphysema and maybe mediastinal air being present. But the head cheese sign, this is the term has been taken from the appearance of from a pig's head, the meat which is made, and it is made into a jelly, and that is how this sign has come to. The appearance is somewhat similar to that. There are different patterns, black, white, and sort of gray areas, and that has led to the appearance being called as a head cheese sign. So this is highly sensitive for chronic HP. Now, the other investigations after the radiology are the histopathology, and bronchoscopy with lung biopsy is, of course, the mainstay for diagnosis. Again, the differential diagnosis is from UIP or NSIP, and if in the lavage fluid there is a high percentage of lymphocytes, especially if the lymphocyte count is more than 30 to 40%, it is very highly likely that it is a case of chronic HP as compared to IPF. And the CD4, CD8 ratio throughout HP changes. In early or acute HP, the CD4 counts will be less, while as the chronicity increases, the CD8 cells generally get depleted. So not all pathologists will be doing this, but where it can be done, this is a useful adjunctive investigation. Now, histopathology requires an experienced pathologist to actually determine the diagnosis, and there may be a combination of findings which are characteristic of UIP, some which may be characteristic, including patchy fibrosis with subpleural paraseptal distribution, fibroblastic foci, and honeycombing. Some sort of findings which are more common in chronic HP are the central lobular fibrosis or inflammation, or it is also called the bridging fibrosis, which is extending up to the pleura, significant lymphoid or plasmacytic infiltrate, particularly outside the fibrotic areas, and small granulomas or giant cells. And these are just to show some of the fibrosis with the micro honeycombing and with the peribronchial and central lobular distribution and multiple giant cell granulomas. So I think the treatment part will be taken up by Dr. Sehgal, but I'll be just discussing a little bit about progressive fibrosis, ILDs. And this is a new term which has come up in the past few years, and includes all ILDs which have progressed after some point, and which tend to have similar biological and clinical behaviors. That is, there is a self-sustaining fibrosis, progressive decline in lung function, and early mortality. So this is difference. It does not matter how the fibrosis has occurred. Once the fibrosis has occurred, the prognosis more or less, or the behavior is more or less similar. And it's a large, there are many types of ILDs and all end up in the same way. So of course the IPF is the prototype, but other ILDs like sarcoidosis, exposure-related ILDs, autoimmune ILDs, Dr. Amit Sharma was talking about them, non-IPF, interstitial idiopathic pneumonias, and chronic HP, other ILDs. So all these are part of the spectrum of progressive fibrosic ILDs. And the knowns about these are they have common pathogenetic mechanisms after a point, leading to self-sustaining fibrosis, decline in lung function, deterioration in quality of life, and early mortality. And the unknowns, there are some unknowns whether to use immunosuppression. I think all this will be covered by Dr. Sehgal. There are some factors which are specifically associated with increased mortality and hypersensitivity pneumonitis in chronic HP. That is, there are some intrinsic factors and some extrinsic factors. The intrinsic factors include the increased age, male, gender, and presence of other autoimmune disorders, development of pulmonary hypertension, and extensive fibrosis. While the extrinsic factors would be if the agent, inciting agent is unidentified, and there is a long duration of exposure to the agent, and smoking. So there are some findings that in smoking may be protective against patients from developing HP because it reduces the immune function of the cells at the local level. However, once the patient develops HP, the prognosis is poorer in patients who smoke. So it's a poor trade-off, and I don't know whether one can really say that it has a protective effect on it. And this is just a small study to show that the decline in FVC is not much too different in the IPF and the chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis cases. So I would summarize by saying that the chronic HP is one of the more common ILDs which a pulmonologist can see in the routine OPDs. It behaves different from acute and subacute HP. a high index of suspicion is required for the diagnosis. There is no single diagnostic test, and it is one of the components of the progressive fibrosing ILD phenotype. Thank you.
In time, the important point made here is that that hypersensitivity pneumonitis, in particular chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis, behaves almost similarly as the sorry, can you hear me? Or
Yes.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
okay, thank you. So it behaves almost similarly as IPF. We shall again come to the question answers later on. I'll now request Dr. Sahjal to talk about the treatment of pulmonary fibrosis. I know it's a short time for him for the total treatment, so I'd like him to focus on pulmonary fibrosis component in particular.
Thank you very much, sir. Can you see my presentation, Rahul?
Not yet, sir.
Not yet.
Just a minute.
So you'll have to do the same steps, sir.
Yeah, just a minute. What is happening?
Share screen.
So it should be below the green, below option, sir. So once if you, and you can click on the PPT tab now, sir.
Yeah, just a minute. Sorry. Some problem.
Perfect, sir.
Now can you see?
Perfect, sir.
Screen? Okay. So my topic, first of all, thank you so much, sir, my teacher, and all the other speakers who have spoken before me. My topic is a very focused topic. It is the role of antifibrotic drugs for the treatment of pulmonary fibrosis. And mostly I love sticking to my topic, but here I will just take some liberty and touch upon certain basics of IPF and non-IPF pulmonary fibrosis, because these are two fundamentally different types of pulmonary fibrosis that we encounter. And I'm doing this because that has implications on the therapy. So the issues that I'll take up are, what is the difference between idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, that is IPF, and other fibrosing interstitial lung diseases? What are the major fibrosing ILDs that we encounter? Are all fibrosing ILDs progressive? What are antifibrotic drugs and what are the differences between the available antifibrotic drugs? What is the approach to the treatment of IPF? And what is the approach to the treatment of non-IPF progressive fibrosing ILDs? So moving on to my first question, what is the difference between IPF and other progressive fibrosing interstitial lung diseases? So you have already listened to Dr. Aman speaking about CTD ILDs and Dr. Aditya speaking about HP, and he has also taken up the definition of progressive fibrosing ILDs. So IPF, as you know, is a very specific ILD where there is a suggestive clinical picture in terms of an old patient, mostly a male patient, mostly a smoker who comes to you. There's a suggestive radiologic picture, which I'm going to elaborate. And there is, if needed, a biopsy is performed, a surgical lung biopsy or a transbronchial cryobiopsy, where there is a suggestive histologic picture. And nowadays, with excellent HRCT scans and the development of very specific guidelines for IPF, we require biopsies only in about 5 to 10% of cases, depending on different centers. And the final thing to define IPF is there should be no evident cause to explain the ILD that is present. So moving on to the HRCT features, that is the suggestive radiologic picture of IPF. So as you know that it consists of bibasilar, that is bilateral lower lobe predominant disease with a lot of reticulation, that is thickening of the interstitial septae, that is interlobular and intralobular septae. And then this kind of pattern, which consists of stacks of cysts starting from the subpleural space, moving inward towards the lung. And that is called honeycombing. So once these features are present in a suggestive clinical setting, that is an elderly individual or a person with age more than 60 years and mostly a male, mostly a smoker, then you make a diagnosis of IPF. How to exclude the known causes? So I'll give you a mnemonic for this: A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So you can just rearrange the words and make it CDEF and ABG. So what is CDEF? So this is a consensus statement framed by Dr. Jindal and myself, where 50 experts from all over the country came together and sat together and finally gave this statement on the treatment and diagnosis of IPF. So there we have clearly suggested that you rule out connective tissue disorders, drugs, environmental exposures, and familial disease before you label a patient as IPF. So this is the CDEF: connective tissue disorders, diseases, drugs, environmental exposures, and familial disease. So after CDEF comes the ABG. So once you have clinically done this, that is on history and examination, you have tried to rule out these 4 things, CDEF, then you come to antibodies. So antibodies are, that is the testing for the causes of ILD. So antibodies mainly consist of the autoantibodies for autoimmune diseases or CTDs, which Dr. Aman has already focused on. And then you have these antibody panels for HP, which are now becoming available commercially. And it may consist of anywhere from 5 to 40 antibodies, that is 5 to 40 antigens against which antibodies are tested. But they mainly consist of antigens, antibodies against thermoactinomyces, fungi, and bird feathers, serum, and droppings. As Dr. Aditya has already told you, that these are the major causes for hypersensitivity pneumonitis. Then after this, if you are not able to make a diagnosis based on clinical antibody testing and radiology, that is HRCT scan, then you move on to things like a bronchoalveolar lavage and biopsy, and finally genetic testing, which is not commercially available. It's just an investigative tool for looking at the familial causes of ILDs. So once you have ruled out all this, you make a diagnosis of IPF. But other than IPF, what are the other fibrosing ILDs? So that takes us back to the CDEF, that is connective tissue disorders, drug-induced ILDs, environmental exposure-related ILDs, and familial ILDs. So these are the other non-IPF ILDs. And the last one which remains, which does not come into the classic definition of the interstitial pneumonias, is sarcoidosis. So when sarcoidosis turns fibrotic in its stage 4, that is also a fibrosing ILD. So in front of your screens, on your screens are these common causes of ILDs which can develop fibrosis in their course. So amongst the environmental exposures, you can see that chronic HP, silicosis, pneumoconiosis, and radiation-induced fibrosis are the major ones which can cause lung fibrosis. So I'm focusing on this because of a very important survey that we performed about 4 years back, and 3 years back we published it, wherein we found that about 30% of the physicians, this is a survey of physicians who attended a CME at our center, 30% of them believed that ILD and IPF terms can be used interchangeably. But now you know that IPF and ILD are not same. And 60% of the patients believe that IPF occurs in those with a CTD. And now you know that CTD ILD is a different group of diseases, and IPF is something different where there is no cause to be found. Why I'm focusing on this too much is because it has treatment implications, because there's a fundamental difference between IPF and other PF-ILDs. IPF is primarily fibrotic. If you do a full surgical lung biopsy in IPF, you will find little inflammation. It will be all fibrosis. While in most of the other PF-ILDs, if you take CTD-ILDs, if you take HP, if you take sarcoidosis, it mostly starts with inflammation and then secondarily becomes fibrotic. So that is the basic difference, the fundamental difference between IPF and other PF-ILDs. Moving on to my next question. What are the major fibrosing ILDs we encounter? So Dr. Aditya has already shown you the data from the Indian ILD registry. We performed a study on our own at our center, which is the largest single center study in the world of 800 subjects of the, on the spectrum of ILDs. So we found that sarcoidosis, IPF, CTD ILDs, and HP were the major causes. And there was another fifth group, which consisted of lots of different entities, which we call non-IPF idiopathic interstitial pneumonias, which consists of something like idiopathic, NSIP, and cryptogenic organizing pneumonia mainly. So this is the spectrum. So you remember that apart from IPF, there is sarcoid, CTD-ILD, HP, and idiopathic interstitial pneumonias, which are the major ILDs that we encounter in our clinical practice. Now, the next question, are all fibrosing ILDs progressive? The answer is no, because we see in clinical practice not uncommonly that there is stage 4 fibrotic sarcoidosis, which remains stable over long periods of time. So patients develop a stage 2, stage 3 sarcoid. They are treated, but they develop signs of fibrosis, but then they remain stable either without therapy or with minimal therapy with a small dose of prednisolone or methotrexate. We commonly encounter RA-ILD patients with some bit of UIP-like pattern, but they don't progress. Systemic sclerosis ILD, once it gets burnt out, once it is treated properly with immunosuppression, including something like cyclophosphamide and mycophenolate, it does not progress. Even 90%, like 90% of systemic sclerosis patients have evidence of ILD on HRCT scans, but only 30 to 40% of them are clinically significant. The rest don't have clinically significant ILD. They don't even have symptoms. They don't progress, but they do have some signs of pulmonary fibrosis on their CT scans. Similarly, fibrotic HP in many cases does not progress, but in some of the cases it does progress, just like IPF, as Dr. Aditya has already elaborated. So what is progressive fibrosing ILD? Again, Dr. Aditya has told you that there are two terms, fibrosing and progressive. So one, there should be signs of fibrosis in terms of traction bronchiectasis or honeycombing on HRCT, which should be more than 10% of the pulmonary parenchyma. Then there should be signs of progression in terms of decline in the FVC or decline in the FVC along with some radiologic progression of fibrosis. Moving on to my next question. What are antifibrotic drugs and what are the differences between them? So there are two currently available antifibrotic drugs, nintedanib and pirfenidone. Nintedanib is mainly a multiple tyrosine kinase inhibitor. It inhibits multiple tyrosine kinases. Pirfenidone has pleiotropic actions, but it is mainly a TGF-beta antagonist. So what is the difference between the two antifibrotics? So pirfenidone, the full dose of pirfenidone is mostly given by means of 12 tablets, but now we have an 800 milligram tablet available. So the pill burden has got reduced to 3 tablets per day, while with nintedanib it is 2 tablets. The cost with the pirfenidone with the availability of generics is less than 6,000 per month. With nintedanib it is more than 60,000 per month. And then the adverse effect profile differs between the two drugs, wherein pirfenidone is mainly associated with anorexia, dyspepsia, and nausea, while with nintedanib, diarrhea is the most common side effect. So now moving on to what is the approach to the treatment of IPF. So the basic principles are that do not prescribe any immunosuppressants in patients with IPF, because the prior practice of giving azathioprine with prednisolone and N-acetylcysteine was not the right practice. In the Panther IPF trial, it showed that it causes increased mortality. So that should not be used. Even N-acetylcysteine monotherapy does not work, and in some cases may cause harm depending on the genetic predisposition. So the only two drugs effective in the treatment of IPF are the antifibrotic drugs. How does pirfenidone help in IPF? It reduces the rate of decline in lung function. It reduces the fall in exercise capacity, and thus it also improves survival. There is evidence from these 3 trials, Capacity 1, Capacity 2, and Ascend trials. We have published our own experience with the use of pirfenidone in 128 patients. This paper got published just a week back, wherein we enrolled 128 patients, and we could give pirfenidone in 115 subjects. And 13 of the subjects we did not start because of various reasons. About 20% of the subjects discontinued pirfenidone. About 15 of them mainly due to adverse effects. So it causes lots of adverse effects which can lead to discontinuation of pirfenidone. And we could use the full dose of 2400 milligram in about 43% of patients. This is a small number, less than 50%, just 43% patients. But this is contrary to the popular belief that we see amongst our physicians that this full dose is not tolerated in any patient or less than 10% patients. That is not the case. At least in our population, about 40% of the patients could tolerate this dose. Another 30% could tolerate a dose between 1800 and 2400 milligram. So above 1800 dose is tolerated by about 75% of subjects, contrary to popular belief. The major side effects were, as I've already told you, anorexia, dyspepsia, nausea, and the side effect profile is not very different in our subjects compared to a study from Denmark, which was published in 2016. So it is very similar figures of tolerance. And we noticed that there is a survival improvement with the use of pirfenidone, but this survival advantage is seen mainly with the full dose. If you reduce the dose, there is some trend to improve survival, but that is not significant in our study. So full dose should be used mostly. So while prescribing pirfenidone, please target a dose of 2400 milligram per day, which is the full dose. Start with 600 milligram per day and keep on increasing the dose every 3 days or maybe every 7 days, depending on the patient's tolerance. Ask the patient to take the drug with food because it improves the tolerance. Strictly instruct the patient not to get exposed to sunlight because of very bad photosensitive rash develops in patients taking pirfenidone who are sensitive to it. And then you have to monitor LFTs very closely in the initial period. Next, how does nintedanib help in IPF? Similar to pirfenidone, it also reduces the rate of decline of FVC. It increases the time to first exacerbation, which has not been proven with pirfenidone. And it possibly also improves life expectancy. And this data comes from INPULSIS and the TOMORROW trials. So this is the kind of improvement that we see. So in the placebo arm of these trials, the FVC declined by 220 ml, while in the nintedanib arm by 110 ml over a period of 1 year. So difference of 110 ml of FVC was there in a period of 1 year of treatment. There is some post hoc analysis of these of 5 different RCTs on nintedanib, and it is a kind of a modeling that has been done. And one of the models shows that nintedanib also improves life expectancy when it is administered in IPF. So prescribing nintedanib, you give a dose of 150 milligram twice daily. It comes in the form of capsules, which are to be swallowed as a whole. Again, it is given after meals. If there are side effects, you can reduce the dose to 100 BD, monitor LFTs, and the drug is contraindicated in patients who are on high dose antiplatelet therapy or anticoagulants. How to choose between the two drugs, which drug to give? So in our consensus statement, we agreed upon this fact that treatment should be started with monotherapy because both the drugs have lots of side effects and we don't have data on combination therapy, whether it works better than a monotherapy. So everybody should be started on monotherapy, and which drug to choose should be decided by telling the patient about the evidence and the adverse effects, and an informed choice should be made in discussion with the patient. And similar is the guideline, similar is the recommendation given by the ICF NCCP ILD guidelines that got published in Lung India just 2 weeks back, which is the ILD guidelines, Indian ILD guidelines 2020. So what is the approach to the treatment of non-IPF fibrosing ILDs? So I'll give you basic principles because there are so many different non-IPF ILDs. So I told you HP, stage 4 sarcoid and CTD ILDs are the major non-IPF ILDs. So the basic principle of treatment is, first of all, ascertain that there is fibrosis based on HRCT scans, ascertain that there is progression based on symptoms, spirometry and HRCT, and then ascertain that the patient has already received the appropriate maximal therapy for the type of ILD he or she has. The primary treatment of CTD ILDs, chronic HP, sarcoidosis is not antifibrotics. We come across a lot of prescriptions after the availability of these two drugs that every ILD patient gets started on a mixture of steroid, azathioprine, nintedanib, pirfenidone, everything is given. So that is not the right approach to go by. The primary treatment of these disorders are, for example, CTD ILD. The most common are systemic sclerosis ILD and RA-ILD, rheumatoid arthritis ILD. The recommended treatment to be initiated is cyclophosphamide followed by azathioprine. It can be replaced by mycophenolate in some patients. And in patients who are not responding to the above two, rituximab can also be used, and it has been shown to have good effects in both these kind of diseases. With chronic HP, you start the treatment with glucocorticoids and you may add mycophenolate either upfront or after looking at the response to glucocorticoids. And if the patients progress on that, then you can move on to antifibrotics. Sarcoidosis, again, you know, the primary treatment is with prednisolone or other glucocorticoids. These second line drugs are methotrexate and azathioprine. And then only you say that sarcoid is progressing despite maximal therapy. So when to start antifibrotics in these diseases? First of all, ensure that it is not IPF. If it is IPF, you start antifibrotics. If it is not IPF, then find out what is the cause, that is CDEF. Make the accurate diagnosis of the ILD subtype. Ensure that the maximal standard of care treatment for this ILD subtype has been given for a reasonable duration, and then take a call on antifibrotics. And now, which agent to use? We have two antifibrotics, pirfenidone and nintedanib. Which agent to use? So moving on to the currently available evidence. So this evidence is very fresh. So I'll tell you a bit about the evidence, the trials. Pirfenidone, only one trial is available as of now, one major trial. It is a phase 2 trial in unclassifiable ILDs. So it is not specific ILDs. It is just unclassifiable ILDs, which could not be classified either into IPF or the specific ILD subtypes. There is more evidence available for nintedanib. The Census trial, which was nintedanib in systemic sclerosis ILD, and the INBUILD trial, which was the use of nintedanib in other progressively fibrosing ILDs. Now, I'll just tell you what were the problems with these trials. The Pirfenidone trial, only one phase 2 trial is available. There is no phase 3 trial. Secondly, the primary outcome was based on daily home spirometry, which is not a very commonly used thing to do in trials. Daily home spirometry is a good method that you tell the patient to perform a home spirometry, but that should not be taken as a primary outcome. The secondary outcome was laboratory performed spirometry. There was a significant difference in the secondary outcome, that is a laboratory performed spirometry. But you always assess a trial mainly by the primary outcome, always, because all kinds of designing of the trial, the sample size calculation is based on primary outcome. For the primary outcome, there is no statistically significant difference between Pirfenidone and placebo. Now coming on to the census trial, it showed that there was a significant difference in the FVC decline between the nintedanib arm and the placebo arm. But the difference, as you saw in IPF, was 110 ml over 1 year. With systemic sclerosis, this difference was as small as just 41 ml over 1 year. You may say that it may be due to the systemic sclerosis ILD progressing very slowly, because even in the placebo arm, it progressed very slowly. But you can look at the confidence intervals also, they are very wide. So the difference in the FVC decline may be as small as 3 ml or as large as 80 ml. The average is 40 ml. 40 ml is not a clinically significant difference in FVC. A clinically significant difference means what the patient can perceive. So 100 ml is generally taken as a clinically significant difference between in the decline in the FVC. So this is a statistically significant difference, not a clinically significant one, but it is still a significant difference, and this is the only available drug with some evidence of being of use in this kind of a fibrosing ILD. Then moving on to the last trial, that is INBUILT trial. The good thing about this trial was that they enrolled hypersensitivity pneumonitis, autoimmune ILDs, that is CTD ILDs, idiopathic ILDs, and unclassifiable ILDs in good numbers. So they had all the spectrum, which are the most common non-IPF ILDs. But the problems were that no uniform criteria was used for the diagnosis of these ILDs. The diagnosis was completely left to individual physician participants. There was no central team who was making the diagnosis. The mean study age was 66 years, which is almost the age at which IPF is diagnosed. So there is some possibility that many of these patients actually had IPF. The population was enriched for subjects with a UIP pattern, which is the classic pattern associated with IPF. And the rate of lung function decline in the placebo group, who received no treatment, no antifibrotic treatment, was just like that observed with IPF. So we expect that with non-IPF fibrosing ILDs, the rate of decline is slightly less than what we see in IPF. Just like in systemic sclerosis ILD, the rate of decline is not as high as that we see in IPF. So these are the drawbacks of these trials, which I needed to point out. So now coming on to what do we have practically. So in those with fibrosing ILDs who have progressed on an appropriate immunosuppressive treatment, which I told you, what is the appropriate treatment for CTD ILDs, HP, and sarcoidosis. In those patients, antifibrotics may be offered with full understanding of the drawbacks that we have in the evidence. So the evidence is still not rock solid, mainly because there is no alternative. So once you have these patients who are progressing on immunosuppressants, you don't have any alternative, you have to go to antifibrotics. There is more evidence for nintedanib for ILDs such as HP, fibrosing CTD ILDs, and idiopathic NSIP. Lesser evidence for Pirfenidone, mainly for unclassifiable ILDs. So nintedanib may be chosen over Pirfenidone in some of these patients, especially if they are affording for the drug. So coming on to my take-home messages. Always make an effort to differentiate between IPF and non-IPF ILDs. Clinical, humoral meaning antibodies, radiologic and histologic clues may help in this differentiation. For IPF, Pirfenidone and nintedanib are the only two drugs that have been found effective. Use Pirfenidone 2400 milligram per day or nintedanib 300 milligram per day. Do not prescribe immunosuppressants in patients with IPF as they cause harm. N-acetylcysteine monotherapy also does not work, may be harmful in some. For non-IPF PF ILDs, ascertain that there is fibrosis and there is progression. Ascertain that the patient has received appropriate maximal therapy for the type of ILD he or she has. Antifibrotic treatment may be offered with full understanding of the drawbacks of the evidence that we have. And nintedanib may be chosen over Pirfenidone in affording patients, especially for chronic HP and CTD ILDs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Saigal. Sahil, sorry again it come. So again, a very illuminating talk. I'm sure there is a lot to discuss of the management, you see, of pulmonary fibrosis in general, idiopathic as well as seen in some of these conditions. So I think I'll take some of the questions which have been put forward by the audience. But before that, I shall just put to the panelists, you see, that we have kind of, we also have Dr. Mandal now. I think welcome Dr. Mandal. I am sure he joined in between, you see. Dr. Mandal, as I already introduced to you, is senior consultant pulmonologist at the Fortis Hospital, Mohali. Well, I think there is some amount of difference between the academic medicine and the practical aspects of treating pulmonary fibrosis, you see, especially these like pulmonary fibrosis, which is not easy to kind of diagnose, especially the specific cause in the private setup. I'm sure pulmonary fibrosis is seen by all pulmonologists and internists all over, you see. Many of them do not have the kind of liberty or facilities to do kind of sophisticated, or I would say invasive investigations, including the lung biopsy in particular. So how important is the lung biopsy in making a diagnosis of idiopathic versus CTD-induced fibrosis or hypersensitivity fibrosis or other causes, and of course to differentiate the types of pulmonary fibrosis as such, so the different type of idiopathic interstitial pneumonia, especially these days when we are converging to a kind of uniform kind of treatment for most of these patients, especially the fibrosing variety. So I'll put this question to all the panelists. Maybe we'll begin with Dr. Sharma, you see, and I'll again request the panelists to be brief in their replies.
Yes, sir. And sir, my perspective would be with respect to the CTDs. And fortunately for us, most of the patients have the clinical pointers towards the underlying disease. And in practical scenario, we don't really need open lung biopsy by and large in most of these patients. And when you correlate the clinical pointers at some of those which I showed, along with the CT findings, there's hardly any patient who would probably need. It's only one of its life kind of a patient, as the one that I gave an example, wherein even with therapy there was some mediastinal node, some lung involvement, and interstitial lung disease kind of manifestation also. But what made us do the lung biopsy was the lack of response to steroids and other immunosuppressive therapy. So those was one off, but those are very, very rare conditions. So in a nutshell, we don't really need open lung biopsy, to be very honest, in almost all the patients with CTD associated interstitial lung disease.
I think I can understand that in CTDs, the sero or the presence of autoantibodies, I suppose, plus the clinical features are really glaring, you see, so make the diagnosis relatively easier, you see. We'll come to you again afterwards. Aditya, in cases of hypersensitivity or suspected hypersensitivity pneumonias, do you think lung biopsy is important, and will it distinguish between IPF and chronic hypersensitivity?
I think there are many points to be taken up here. One is whether we want to go for an open lung biopsy versus a bronchoscopic guided lung biopsy. And surgical lung biopsy is definitely indicated only when there is a significant diagnostic dilemma, and it will actually lead to a major change in the management. Bronchoscopic guided lung biopsy is much easier to do and has good results in many cases. Other thing is I would want to say is that if a clinical diagnosis, a non-invasive diagnosis can be established and it is very clear. For example, if a patient has IPF And it is very clear patient has a honeycombing, low predominance, all the classical features of IPF. I don't think anybody would want to go for a biopsy. And the same is, I would say, in many other diseases, like even maybe in chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis, where you have classical upper lobe fibrotic areas. There is a history of antigen exposure, and probably I don't think there is any need for a biopsy in those cases. Again, similarly in established connective tissue disorders where there are peripheral signs, there is antibody positivity. But in cases where there are diagnostic difficulties, there are early cases, there are atypical findings, there might be mediastinal lymph nodes, there is sarcoid, there very suggests suspect sarcoidosis. I think those are the cases where a biopsy would be helpful. And
Okay.
I would probably go for a bronchoscopic lung biopsy rather than an open lung biopsy in most of the cases.
Okay, Dr. Mandal, can you tell us whether you resort to doing lung biopsy before making a diagnosis and starting treatment, or just go by clinical features? And what is your experience?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, as very well highlighted by Dr. Aman and Dr. Aditya already, lung biopsy, sir, in our private sector is hardly done. And if you do, we probably end up doing just probably a BAL or probably a transbronchial lung biopsy, and that is again a bronchoscopic biopsies. But then most of our diagnosis in the last couple of years, since we have started engaging with both our rheumatologists as well as our radiologists, the need for biopsies is going down. Yes, the opportunities where we feel that we could probably end up with doing an intervention are patients typically presenting with exacerbation and having some features of fibrotic lesions, and especially as Dr. Aditya mentioned, patients presenting late, probably hypersensitive pneumonitis, but now having some honeycombing changes and some fibrotic changes predominantly. So when the fibrotic elements are more, that's when the gray areas are occurring. But yes, sir, most of our patients do not undergo lung biopsy because of the morbidity, the cost, and the risks involved. We are unable to do that.
Okay, thank you. Sajal, can you
Yes, sir.
also?
Sir, I would agree with most of the points that now the world is moving from more biopsies to less biopsies again. But the practices are different in different countries, different setups. If we look at the practices in UK, they have come down to only 5% of ILD patients are being subjected to lung biopsies. In, say, centers in Italy, it may be as high as 20-25%. It all depends on the multidisciplinary team that you have and what experience does it have. And if they are very well informed, if they're good radiologists, and if they can reach to a conclusion that this is the kind of subtype of ILD that we can make out on clinical and radiologic terms, a lung biopsy should be avoided in most of these circumstances. More important thing is, whenever you do a lung biopsy, you should do the appropriate kind of lung biopsy. It is, you have a choice between the routine transbronchial lung biopsy, the transbronchial cryobiopsy, and the surgical lung biopsy. I would say that if it's a minimal peripheral predominant disease, if you do something like a TBLB or cryobiopsy, it's not the right way to go. You should go with surgical lung biopsy in those cases. But if you have diffuse involvement, more central disease, then a cryobiopsy may help. A TBLB should not be resorted to in most of the cases, in suspected sarcoid and in some of the patients with organizing pneumonia, in patients who have a non-fibrotic HP as a suspicion. These three cases, TBLB may give a reasonable kind of yield, but otherwise you should go ahead with a cryobiopsy or a surgical lung biopsy, depending on the type of involvement. But again, I would say these procedures have their own risks. They can lead to acute exacerbations. They can lead to a progressive decline of lung function after an exacerbation, which we have reported also. So always it has to be decided after a good MDD with a good radiologist. Don't jump onto it. But in some cases, I would again like to say, in some cases it does make a difference. So don't rule it out completely.
Yeah, I think that is quite reasonable, and all the three panelists agree with that finding, that lung biopsy is not routinely done except in kind of very high index suspicion cases, you see, and whenever possible it should be either a cryobiopsy or an open surgical biopsy. But certainly transbronchial lung biopsy is useful in certain situations like sarcoidosis and organizing pneumonias and so on. I'll take some of the questions which have been put forward by the audience. This by Dr. Soumya Jain. role of hydroxychloroquine in lung dominant CTD or UCTD associated ILD. I think HCQ nowadays is quite popular these days. So can Dr. Sharma take this?
Yeah, sir, I think we, in a small nutshell, I don't think we have any evidence of hydroxychloroquine use in such a scenario in adults. There are some case reports of its use in children. And I think there is a randomized trial which people have started with equivocal. I mean, the evidence is equivocal, but there are not, I don't think there is any robust evidence, or we don't really consider it as a therapeutic option whenever we are up against a CTD ILD patient. And Sajal very beautifully showed the drugs which we fall back upon. We don't really treat the milder disease. And once there is a severe enough disease to be treated, then there are other drugs which are far more potent, like cyclophosphamide or other drugs which Sajal had beautifully pointed out. I don't think, in nutshell, I won't really be considering it seriously unless there is compelling evidence of its use in CTD ILD.
I think this question is an extension of the use of hydroxychloroquine for control of inflammation, both for,
Yes.
for example, rheumatoid arthritis, sarcoidosis as well. You see that way.
So most of these conditions, like we use hydroxychloroquine, is the backbone drug for lupus. It's used in rheumatoid arthritis. Some people use it in systemic sclerosis also. And there was a recent paper wherein it was said that all autoimmune diseases, including vagus, should also be treated with hydroxychloroquine. That's a general kind of whether it can be the standalone drug for these kind of presentation. The answer would be no. But many of these patients would be already on. Having said that, it has come into the focus because of COVID, we are all aware. But even there are evidence for, we don't have a very robust evidence. There are some studies which showed that there might be a role for prophylaxis, especially the one published by in the Indian Journal of Medical Research by our own people. But I think the jury is still out. I don't think we know the last word, whether it does really help or it doesn't help.
Other panelists, Dr. Mandal or Sajal, you like to speak something on?
I completely agree with Dr. Aman sir. HCQS is not a good drug for any kind of ILD. In sarcoidosis, mostly in skin sarcoidosis and other milder forms, and possibly in some stage 1 sarcoid, it may be used, but not in advanced lung involvement, not in CTD ILDs, not even in sarcoid.
Okay. Dr. Mandal, you would like to?
No, nothing to add, sir. Nothing to add.
Nothing to add. You agree with that, you see. All right, then there is another question. How do we define progression of disease in IPF or ILD? Sajal, can you?
Sir, I've already answered in the chat also, and I showed a slide. So there are, it is a term that has come up only recently in the past 3 or 4 years. And there is one main definition which has been proposed, that if there's a decline in the FVC by 10% over a period of 24 months, it's all over a period of 24 months. So either of the three, one is decline in FVC by 10%. Second one is decline in FVC between 5 and 10% along with increased fibrosis on HRCT or increased symptoms. And the third one is increased symptoms with increased fibrosis on HRCT. So if any of these criteria are met, then you can say that there is progression. And if you want to define a progressive fibrosing ILD, then the criteria for fibrosis also should be met. And fibrosis is represented on an HRCT by traction bronchiectasis and honeycombing, and it should be more than 10% of the lung parenchyma. So these are the specific criteria by which to define progressive fibrosing ILD.
Using perfenidone or nintedanib in post-COVID fibrosis. I think that's another point. Maybe.
No evidence, because COVID is a recent disease.
Yes,
But the point is that the thing what is happening is that we have fibrosis, we have antifibrotics. So the treatment of fibrosis is antifibrotics. This is not the case. Many of the fibrosis are just non-progressive. They are just residual changes. As you see in post-TB fibrosis, there are so many patients who have post-TB fibrosis who go on their entire lives without anything. So that does not mean you give antifibrotics in them also. So post-COVID fibrosis will also have different kinds of natural histories. One may be progressive, the other may be non-progressive. For non-progressive fibrosis, you don't use antifibrotics. Mostly post-COVID interstitial lung diseases starts with an organizing pneumonia pattern, where steroids may be primarily effective. The dose and duration we don't know, the risks we don't know. But that is the primary therapy if there's an organizing pneumonia pattern, which consists of patchy consolidation and ground glass opacities. Once it goes to something like extensive reticulation, that is septal thickening and traction bronchiectasis, then it gets defined as fibrosis. Again, you should watch, maybe give a small dose of steroid for some time. And then if it progresses, then we can consider antifibrotics, just like we discussed in other primarily inflammatory diseases.
I think, yes.
Yes.
And that will be off-label compassionate use. That will not
The
be
other thing which I wish to just drive home is that nintedanib census trial, the background MMF has not really been highlighted. More than 50% of the patients were taking MMF. So if you take that away, then will be the real game whether they make a change or not. So as beautifully highlighted by Sahil, unless it should never be the first line in connective tissue disease associated interstitial lung disease. Still, because many times we see prescriptions whereas immunosuppression has not been given, but the patient has straightway started antifibrotics. So that is something which he beautifully highlighted in his presentation and has to be driven home. And also we have to look at the evidence with a pinch of salt. And he, I think, did drive home that even in the census trial, the background MMF, majority of those, and they did not do the subgroup. I am not aware, probably whether there was a subgroup analysis which
there is no subgroup, sir. But I did an interesting. I looked at it interestingly. If you divide it into 4 groups, for example, there was a group who was receiving MMF and nintedanib, 25% of the patients. Then there were 25% of the patients who were receiving only MMF and placebo. So that is only MMF.
Right.
One group was nintedanib only, and the 4th group was none of these drugs. If you just look at the FVC decline in the 4 groups, you'll find that the FVC decline was equal in the group who were receiving MMF only or nintedanib only.
Right.
Those who were receiving both the drugs had the best advantage. They had the minimum FVC decline, and those who were receiving none had the worst kind of FVC
So I think
decline.
the next trial,
but
which
this is just an interesting observation. This cannot be relied upon because these are just subgroups. This is not evidence. But that was an interesting observation.
Probably the next trial, which is factors into this. What is that? The next study. I'm forgetting the name. So probably that might answer this question. Which is already the trial.
So again, like there may be a scope for maybe combination therapy in these kind of patients where some bit of immunosuppression and some bit of antifibrotics, things which we currently condemn, and it should not be your first line of management. First, you have to see that whether a classic steroid responsive disease is responding to immunosuppression, responding partially to immunosuppression, or not responding at all and just getting fibrosed. So if it is responding, you continue immunosuppressants. If it is partially responding but still fibrosing, possibly there is a scope for combination. And if it is absolutely not responding and continuously fibrosing, there are HRCT signs of progressive fibrosis, then you may completely shift to antifibrotics, especially if there is no systemic sign. For example, there is systemic sclerosis. The disease is systemically quiescent. The joints are fine, the skin is fine, whatever damage has taken place. And now you decide that only the lung disease is progressing, then you may go on to antifibrotics even without.
I think
back to that post-COVID fibrosis, I think the proper thing to compare it would be to, we have post-ARDS sequelae which occur due to other infections also. So again, it is a non-progressive fibrosis. So actually, I don't think the nintedanib or pirfenidone would be useful in this. But again, if we probably have a lot of patients coming up in the next few months, maybe if there is a study, who knows, that it might turn out to be useful. But theoretically speaking, I don't think there should be much because there is no progressive. It is a damage to the lungs, which is single time.
Yes, of course. I think that the issue raised earlier regarding the use of antifibrotic and anti-inflammatory drugs is important, you see. If we really believe that antifibrotic drugs may be useful in prevention of fibrosis, you see, then why not add them in the beginning itself, you see, rather than waiting first to the kind of failure or you can say completion of anti-inflammatory drugs and then start with antifibrotic drugs, you see. of course, you have to establish the diagnosis, or you establish that the fibrosis is occurring. That I accept, you see, and you also have to accept the toxicity and added cost. That is another issue, you see. But therapeutically, wouldn't it be more beneficial to start antifibrotic drugs at an early stage, if not the very beginning, that at an early stage, you see?
So this is a very interesting point. In fact, it has been addressed by a recent study on chronic HP in ERJ that was published about 3 or 4 months back, where they have looked at the pulmonary function values, the FVC of these patients, and they saw that there is an initial rise in FVC with steroids, and then it starts falling, and the patient starts getting progressive fibrosis. So exactly the same thing that you are speaking, and the authors also say that the use of steroids is just delaying the administration of antifibrotics. So that is their conclusion with their study. But the point is that this does not happen in every case. The treatment with antifibrotics is essentially lifelong. Whatever life the patient has, it may be a very long life, it may be a very short life, but it is essentially lifelong. There is no endpoint. So we have to be very sure that what we are administering is the right kind of treatment that the patient requires. We have looked at other options like immunosuppressants already, and they are not working. So definitely early, but not at the start itself. We have to establish that there is progression and there is fibrosis.
And the other thing regarding the immunosuppression is that I think there was a beautiful experience published by our friend Padmanabha Shenoy, which showed that maintaining, all these SLS1 and other studies, they talked about a different duration of immunosuppressive therapy, whereas there have not been many studies which looked at the long-term maintenance with following up with these patients. So as you rightly said, even in the as far as immunosuppression is concerned, we're talking about MMF, that also has to be continued. So that thing also we have to look at probably, and we'll have to, the optimal timing, as Sir said, is the key probably, not keeping it for far when the patient is way down the road.
Okay, there are some questions by Dr. Purvesh, you see. Is there any way of practically identifying normal individuals who are at high risk of developing IPF? First question. Then he has another question. In the current COVID era, what are the differences in CT scan images to distinguish IPF from COVID infection? And some of the new immuno-oncology agents have the risk of pulmonary toxicity, which is similar to IPF and has been fatal in some cases. How do we treat such patients? At-risk patients, can Dr. Mandal or who are the...
Probably Sahajal probably will answer that better, but I think the most at risk will be the people to begin with who are lung functions to begin with at the initial go, as well as the patients who have already radiological features of a significant amount of fibrosis setting. And these would be probably the markers. I don't think we have a definite biomarker as of now to say that if this exists, we can probably classify. I think maybe Sahajal will probably answer it better.
Yes, Sahajal, you would like to say
something? So the question is basically screening for IPF, and this is not a very big thing going on right now in the world. But the point is that you can screen either clinically, do a good clinical examination, or screen with a CT scan. The problem with screening with a CT scan is that this is a very rare disease. It happens only in about 30 per 1 lakh population. The annual incidence is just about between 15 and 30. So it's a very rare disease. The cost effectiveness of this kind of screening is not favorable at all. What happens is that many patients who are undergoing low-dose CT scans for lung cancer screening, they sometimes get incidentally picked up on this kind of CT scan, or the other is coronary CTs when they are done. So these two are the places where these patients get incidentally picked up before they develop symptoms. But then there is a problem there, because as the lung ages, certain interstitial lung abnormalities appear in the lungs, which may look like IPF, but it may not be a progressive disease like IPF. If you start treating all these patients, again, you may be offering potentially toxic treatment to patients who don't require it. So if you encounter such incidentally detected disease, you have to ensure, if it's very mild disease, you can convince the patient for a lung biopsy, because there a surgical lung biopsy will be very useful. The patient will tolerate it well. It will clearly differentiate whether it is just a few interstitial thickenings or it is indeed honeycombing like IPF, where treatment can be started early when the FVC is normal, and then this kind of progression can be prevented.
I agree, guys. I don't think there is any. Yes, Aditya.
I think there are a few syndromes of familial fibrosis where there is a family history of similar to IPF, but these are very rare conditions. So as such, in the general population, as Sejal said, unless and until patient comes to you for with some symptoms, you can't really diagnose the patient. And routine screening is not been useful for even for other types of diseases. So for IPF, again, it's a very rare thing. So I don't think it will be really cost effective or useful.
I agree. I don't think there is any real place for screening as of today. You see, I think the second question, the CT scan images to distinguish IPF from COVID infection. Are there any real pointers? Yes.
So the CT scan image, CT scan pictures of COVID and IPF are absolutely different. In COVID, there is predominantly peripheral consolidation and ground glass opacities. In IPF, it is mainly subpleural reticulation and honeycombing. So they are absolutely different. It is not very difficult to make them out. The main difficulty may be that in a patient who already has IPF, if he presents with the increased respiratory symptoms, whether he has some kind of a unknown cause of exacerbation, or is it a COVID-induced exacerbation, that is the more important thing. So in all such patients, I think with this kind of pandemic going on, they should all be tested for COVID.
Okay, I think the other question is there any role of antifibrotics at any stage of chronic sarcoidosis and HP? Although we have, I think, discussed this issue, but can you really highlight again? You see, and
yes, again. So first is the primary treatment of these disorders, which consists of steroids and other immunosuppressants. If there is clear-cut fibrosis and there is progression, then you start antifibrotics early in the course, so that you can prevent further decline.
Aditya, you would like to say something? Yeah.
One more thing that I would like to add on the first question, sir, the screening part, because some of the experts of IPF really recommend this, that the major thing that you can change in your practice is a careful auscultation of the bases in all patients of respiratory disease that you encounter, whether it is COPD, whether it's a smoker with some kind of other, because that is a very good and simple and cheap means of catching ILD in the beginning, because some patients may not complain of anything, or they may be diagnosed as COPD. You just auscultate them at the bases, you find crackles, and the patient does not know that he has ILD. You clearly diagnose him with ILD, you get a HRCT scan and then further proceed. So even electronic stethoscopes for picking up such crackles have been devised, which can be used by paramedical staff, which are being used in places like UK.
I think I'll put it that should the screening be done for kind of patients such as CTDs or hypersensitivity pneumonia, as you see, that is where it would be more important to find the lung involvement. And what are the real criteria on which we, for example, there is a patient of CTD. Aman, you have already talked about the 3 types of CTD associated ILDs. So should HRCT be done in all these patients of CTDs, irrespective of their symptoms of lung involvement?
Sir, not in all CTDs. Like as I said, the scenarios, we'll have to go by the probability of each CTD being associated with interstitial lung disease. As a dictum, CTD for all patients with systemic sclerosis, probably, and all other patients where there is anti-Jo1 positivity, you have a muscle disease, but anti-Jo1 positivity where you expect there would be a lung disease and we would wish to pick up. And probably also in patients who have muscle disease or have a amyopathic dermatomyositis, but have a MDA associated, we know that in 3 months the patient would be gone. So in those scenarios, I will definitely do an HRCT, and there are protocols to do it. Do those, some people say probably annual CTs for conditions like systemic sclerosis, and Sajan can correct me if I'm wrong. but I won't really do a CT for condition like rheumatoid arthritis. I won't really do it for SLE. I won't really do it for lapsing polychondritis and other things. Having said that, the other thing that I would wish to, and I will take this opportunity here, and I'll as a disclaimer, my bias, many times once in a while, the patients with ANCA vasculitis present like interstitial lung disease, like MPO positive ANCA vasculitis. So if you have EFE joint disease, and if you have those here, I would rather wish to do the autoantibody profiles in patients with lung disease rather than blanket doing a CT for all patients with any kind of CTD.
Okay, Aditya, when will you do CT or HRCT in a patient of hypersensitivity pneumonia? Should, for example, those who present with the acute type or subacute type, will you do CT to determine the chronicity, or the chronicity is determined only on the basis of duration?
So, specifically to hypersensitivity pneumonitis, I would like to do HRCT in most of these cases. First is to establish the diagnosis, and second is to, of course, the chronicity is dependent on the both on the time period which has evolved and on the presence of fibrosis. The treatment options will be different in both cases. Regarding other cases of ILD, of course, it will be different. As Sir has said, I don't think we need a screening, at least a CT scan in all patients of connective tissue disorders or even other ILDs. But I think we can take it from two different angles. So if a person is presenting to us in an acute or a subacute setting with a recent onset of maybe 1 year, 2 years of connective tissue disease or other things, and patient does not have any symptoms of respiratory disease, I don't think we need to really follow up those cases and get them evaluated. Just because we have labeled a patient as systemic sclerosis or as maybe as a SLE or vasculitis or whatever, we don't need to go into the details of the respiratory if there are no symptoms outside a research setting. So I'm not talking about a research setting, I'm talking about routine clinical practice. The situation is different for patients who present chronically. There, a simple history of respiratory symptoms, simple screening, oxygen saturation would be enough to screen those patients who have any respiratory symptoms, and those patients can be taken up for further radiological investigation. So I would not like to screen each and every patient of connective tissue disease for ILD.
Well, there is a last question here now. Is there any way to identify a patient of non-IPF fibrosis who is going to progress or not at the first visit without having any previous CT? So that the previous CT is not available, you are seeing the CT for the first time. So can you talk about the progression of disease or not? Dr. Mandal, you would like to take this question? Or?
I think Sajal took this talk, and I think he'll be the best person to answer. But yes, as I said, I think the CT scan, if it shows some amount of fibrosis in that situation, then obviously these are the patients who are likely to fare worse. And of course, the chronicity or the time duration as to what the patient may have been exposed by the time they come down to us, the different forms of therapy that might have been instituted in the past, whether the history of steroids exists or not. So I think the time, the medications, and of course the radiological picture at that point of time. I think Sajal will probably answer it better.
Sajal?
So I think I've answered on the chat also. The thing is that if a patient has extensive fibrosis and the patient has been symptomatically deteriorating, he must be getting some kind of treatment, some steroid somewhere, some other immunosuppressant. So if there's extensive fibrosis, there is rapid progressive deterioration, then even with your first CT, you can expect that the patient will decline further also. There are no signs of inflammation, the classic signs of inflammation that are, not the classic signs, but the so-called signs of inflammation on CT. For example, extensive ground glassing and extensive consolidation, these are not there. There is just honeycombing. In fact, we did a recent study in RAILD, and there we found that if there is a lot of honeycombing, or if there is extensive traction for bronchiectasis more than a particular HRCT score, then these patients are prone to progressing further. So honeycombing is a good clue, especially if it is extensive. But if there's minor honeycombing, it happens very commonly with RA-ILD that there is some minor honeycombing which stays stable for many years. So it has to be extensive. The patient has to be progressively deteriorating symptomatically. Sir, one question to Dr. Aman. Sir, actually, the recent IPF guidelines and with the advent of this interstitial pneumonia with autoimmune features, they are recommending a very large panel of autoantibodies to be done in all patients. And then you give a final diagnosis of idiopathic. So what is your opinion on that? Because we have designed a very practical kind of small panel. So should a very large extensive panel of 25 antibodies be done in all patients?
You know, that your point is your question is very valid. While when you see from research perspective, as Aditya said, you would need the whole panel, but you will have to tailor the need according to the most common. Like for example, you'll probably do a rheumatoid, you'll do an ANA, you'll do an ANCA, and you will do the Jovan panel. And if there is other antisynthetase panel, and probably maybe an ANCA in a given scenario. The most important thing from my perspective would be to look at all those clinical signs, and also to look at you know, the soft pointers towards presence of, basically why are you doing all that panel? If you are not going to diagnose any connective tissue disease, you know, based upon if you talk about this IPF thing also, you need to have a clinical domain and you need to have other things also. So you can tailor to do the investigations which are possible. In the idealistic setting, if you give the whole antibody profile, the cost will run into, you know, and some of them cannot even be done. So you should do the ones which are more common. And if you have some features, it would make more sense to treat those patients than rather choosing those exotic autoantibodies and, you know, which would cost a lot, but still you will end up treating the same way.
So I'll tell you, sir, the kind of panel we use, we do a ANA by immunofluorescence, not by ELISA. We do a rheumatoid factor, we do an ANCA by immunofluorescence, and we do an anti-CCP antibody. And if we have an organizing pneumonia kind of pattern or some kind of clue to muscle weakness, we do a CPK also in most of these patients. So if there is any clue to myositis, we do an anti-Jovan. The entire synthetase panel is not very widely available. So this is our practice. If ANA is positive, then we go ahead with
others. But there are some others which are outside those. The only change to what you're saying is rather than getting an ANCA done by IAF, the ANCA now has to be done by PR3 and MPO, because there is the international ANCA consensus testing is that the immunofluorescence has got lower sensitivity. The latest third generation, you know, enzyme immunoassays have far greater sensitivity, more than 90%, than an ANCA-IF. So ANCA-IF can also be done by two techniques. So let's not go into those details. But I don't think nowadays the recommendation is to do a PR3 and an MPO. If you still have doubt, you repeat it again with a different kit. And if you still have doubt, then you probably go towards ANCA by immunofluorescence. So the importance of ANCA by IF has gone down dramatically in the recent times. The rest, I agree with you.
For vasculitis, that is our practice, that we get it by ELISA. But for ILD, because it's so rare, so.
But the thing is that you're doing that to pick up MPO, right?
Yeah, true. So I agree.
Okay, I'm sure this discussion can go on and on, you see, but we are limited by time at this stage. Unless any panelists want to say anything. Otherwise, I'm really very thankful to all of you for your very active participation, and to the audience, you see, who was interested in this subject. A lot of, in fact, I was recently reading an article that in the last 25 years in pulmonary medicine, that the best, or not the best, but the most significant advances have been made in the case of pulmonary fibrosis. Although the disease prognosis remains dismal, you see. Unlike asthma, COPD, etc., for which the treatment is there and a lot of drugs are appearing every day. But pulmonary fibrosis, one thing that the total, for example, the pathogenesis has changed from inflammatory to non-inflammatory, fibrotic, and so on, you see, and a lot of advances in treatment have been made, but still the disease and a lot of research remains to be done, and I'm sure people at the PGI and elsewhere in the world, you see, will continue to add to this knowledge, you see. Thank you very much once again.
Thank
for
you,
your
sir,
very
for this
active
opportunity.
participation. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.